In this video, I'll be providing an overview of the privacy enforcement product. This product's primary use is in enforcing compliance law, but it also covers use cases in client-side security and data integrity. First, we'll take a look from the end user's perspective. Here on our demo site, we can see a basic implementation with some of the extra features turned on for the sake of demonstration, as well as some styling to make sure that it matches the theme of the overall view. Here at the bottom of the page, we have what we normally call the footer or the banner. This is the user's first interaction with the privacy experience, and it might be where their experience ends if they have certain configurations set up. In our demonstration tool, we have only the option to dismiss and open up the modal, or in this case, the cookie consent tool, according to the link. In some other versions or in some client versions, we have a large shadow layer over the site to make sure that consent is the only activity they can take. That isn't by default, nor is it necessary for compliance. If we click this link, we'll see the modal pop up. If we had instead clicked dismiss, what we're saying is that we want to accept whatever the default privacy preferences might have been. And if that's opt out, then it means that we're going to stay opted out, which is why some clients choose not to leave it as an option. In the modal, we have the more granular, more detailed version of the experience. This is where the user can choose to opt in or out of certain categories, or if your configuration is this detailed, they might even be able to drill down and opt out of individual vendors. The content here, as well as on the banner, is entirely customizable. These are not templated, they are not mandatory that you use these three categories or this explanatory text for any of them. And these buttons, as well as these links here, are part of additional or optional configuration details. When a user opts out of a certain category, all or some, they can click Save. What happens immediately is that the allow list on the page is modified based on what the configuration of those categories indicated. Let's bring it back up. If instead we did want to, say, submit a form for the CCPA piece, we could click on one of these links if it's configured to appear, and enter our details and submit that into the backend. Now this is where many of the other products in our industry or in our space would consider the interaction complete. They've received the user's consent preferences and set or sent some volume of signals to indicate that consent appropriately. What they won't bother doing is actually enforcing the user's choices. Instead, they're hoping that the signals they've sent requesting a certain outcome will lead to compliant behavior. Your consent platform does not control tag management, your advertising vendors, or malicious content on the page. So this request and hope style of enforcement is only a piece of the necessary effort to actually know that your site is compliant with applicable laws. Our product takes the extra steps necessary to monitor and control content passing into and out of the page at the network request level to ensure that a user's consent choices are honored. Now let's hop over to the interface and talk about how a gateway is configured. A gateway is the name of the configuration or implementation that's being sent to your page. It's configured on this screen, and you can have one or many of them to meet your needs. A basic implementation usually has some sort of prod, maybe a stage and a dev, or at least one of those. But you may have many more. Sometimes we have gateways for different laws, different regions, different sites or platforms. We'll use this production gateway as our example. Inside of our gateway, we're going to set up a couple of core pieces. We're going to decide whether we're in an observation or an enforcement mode, whether we're using an allow list or a block list style of enforcement, and then we're going to decide who or where our users are and what those lists are once they're on the page. Finally, we'll decide what sort of experience they're going to see, and if we need to change that based on the user or the site or anything else. Here on the settings page, we're defining those first few pieces. The enforcement mode indicates whether you're in the observe or the enforce mode. Observe, just like it sounds, is used for observation. It's usually used before enforcement for new gateways, and it helps you with the configuration or the setup steps. Enforce, also like it sounds, is for enforcement. This is where the actual blocking functionality takes place, as well as the enforcement of user consent choices. Blocking mode, allow list or block list, is for defining the default blocking behavior. The allow list creates a tightly controlled set of rules that only allows certain content to pass into and out of the site. Unknowns in this state are blocked by default. The block list is the opposite. Unknowns are allowed, but certain specific elements are blocked when the block list is in use. In the list manager screen, we define those lists we were talking about. This is where the categories that you saw in the modal are created. This is also where the individual vendors and the rules that apply to them are set into the lists if they are applicable to a site. And the uncategorized section here on the left is part of the observe mode, but continues to be useful throughout the lifetime of your gateway. This fills with any domains or content that passes through the site that is not already categorized somewhere here on the right side. On the right side is where you're defining what should be allowed to the site, whether it be vendor content or first party, and whether it's consentable, which is always allowed versus user opt-in, opt-out categories, or never allowed versus user opt-in, opt-out categories. These categories are what we saw in the modal. This is what the user can opt into and opt out of. Whereas, say, the always allowed section is not consent capable. This always passes through, and it's necessary usually for site functionality. Opt-in, opt-out categories are what you want the user to be able to consent to for the sake of compliance law. In the Environments tab, we're deciding who or maybe where the user is, and then using that information in other tabs to define what their lists may be and what sort of experience they're going to receive. Environments are very easy to understand at a high level. They are simply the definition of how you're going to qualify a user. This might mean something like GIP detection, which is going to determine that the user is within a certain region, country, state, etc., and therefore a certain style of compliance is what is applicable to them. It might also mean that they are simply on a certain site, using a certain language. There are many reasons to create environments, but those are the most common. In user consent, we're deciding what the user should see. Are they going to see the banner, which was that piece we saw at the bottom? Are they going to see the modal, which is what we're looking at here? Do they need other sections like global privacy control, Google consent mode, DSAR requests, IAB compliance? And should you set certain default opt-in, opt-out states, which is normally necessary for something like GDPR, which has a requirement to default to opt-out, whereas the US-based laws don't have this requirement and you can begin in an opt-in state. Each piece of this experience is heavily customizable. You might decide to have allow all, deny all buttons. You might choose to granularly customize by applying CSS or repositioning buttons within the UI. Once you've determined that a certain piece of the experience should be shown, it then becomes required that in the environments you've set up, you have to define translations. Translations is what we see here on the right side in my UK English example. This is what the end user is going to see when they arrive on the site and are slotted into or determined to be part of the UK English environment. We can modify this content as needed, both from a styling perspective as well as from the text that the user interacts with. We may even choose to show certain pieces of the experience only to these users. So perhaps this UK English experience has the reject and accept all buttons, but the German experience did not. As I mentioned before, this is also where you find certain optional or niche versions of consent. GPC, or Global Privacy Control, is an optional implementation option that might allow your user to arrive on your site with pre-existing consent settings from another tool or their browser. Google Consent Mode is an integration with GTM, or Google Tag Manager, and assists the user as well as the tagging coming out of GTM with applying consent preferences at the tag level. DSAR, or Data Subject Access requests, are used for the older CCPA laws in California. This is how the user submits a request for their data to be deleted or not used in sale. And the IAB integration is for assisting you in complying with or configuring a much more strict version of the user experience, which is used in the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework. Speaking of IAB, back in the List Manager, in each individual entry is where you'll find the purpose settings, which is useful for configuring your IAB integrations. This is typically where the required elements of a configuration for compliance end. We'll move on to other tools which are useful for extra layers, more security, and more control. Data governance is a feature designed for data integrity and data security on the page. It goes one step further on the earlier mentioned network monitoring and control. It does this by checking the data that's being sent in that request. If that request contains data that it has recognized as not allowed to pass through, or maybe not allowed to pass through to that specific endpoint, it can block the request or modify it before it gets sent out. In this way, for simple cases, you can do things like ensure a social security number does not end up in an unintended field, or in malicious use cases, you can make sure that certain endpoints or unapproved endpoints are not receiving credit card numbers, email addresses, PII. The security tab is additional layers mostly requested by previous or current clients. These enable additional optional layers of security. They close certain paths or vectors of attack from previously known data breaches, or they allow increased access to content on the page. Lastly, on the tour for configuration, I want to talk about the reporting. Reporting here in the tool provides a lot of useful information about what your users are doing in regards to consent and what content is being blocked or allowed on the page. Because we don't want to collect user data without their consent, In the consent report, we're seeing an anonymized view of user interaction and views with the experience itself. Here we get to see at what rate users are opting in and out, which pieces of the experience they've seen, and which pieces they've interacted with during their journey. This is a good place to get an idea of how successful your configuration or styling is in getting acceptance or opt-ins. The block report is much more granular as it's not related to user data. Here we can see information about what's being allowed to pass through the site, whether it's being allowed or blocked, and for what reason a block occurred. This is a great place to return regularly, as you'd like to know whether new items have been added to the site and are being allowed or blocked unexpectedly, or if something's not working on the site and you expected it to do so, you might discover that you forgot to allow it on your allow lists. Observe reporting is the same as block, it's just used for the observe mode. CCPA reporting is used in that form entry I mentioned before, and performance reports is for a more detailed tool that we won't cover in this video, as are consent list and malicious reports.